Hello folks, hello again, it's me Daniel with a slightly different look at the moment, and I have to say that it wasn't necessarily by choice. As you probably saw in the last video, I was attacked by an anonymous stranger, and so I had to take drastic action, but I'm happy to confirm that my corona beard is still growing. Now, I hope I look smart. As you can see, I'm wearing red and white. Why am I wearing red and white? Because of St. George's Day, okay? We talked about this in the teaser the other day. St. George's Day, the 23rd of April. For us English, it's our national day. It's our time to show our Englishness and to show that we are proud to be English. England has given so much to the world. Nothing more important, we could suppose, than the English language, the English tongue itself. And it's the language in which I talk to you today. Now, before we get into it, we're just going to have a look at the backstory, really, of St. George, because, of course, the origins and the legend of St. George are quite different to the story today. Let's begin with the concept of a saint. Now, of course, a saint is somebody who is venerated, beatified, canonized in Christianity, right? And St. George was no different. Who was St. George? Well, like with a lot of saints, the story is shrouded in legend and mystery. Some people take legend with a pinch or a grain of salt. Some people like to believe these stories just for what they are, just stories. And of course, there are those who will say, this happened, this is true. Whatever you believe, this is the backstory. St. George existed apparently a long time ago. We're going back to ancient Rome, imperial Rome, times in which Rome had conquered and colonized most of the known world, right? And St. George was from a place which is now in modern day Turkey, this sort of area, and it was called Asia Minor, or Asia Minor in Latin, but specifically, he came from a place which in English we call Cappadocia. Cappadocia. In Italian, you might call it Cappadocia, something like that. And in Latin, in classical Latin, they would have called it Cappadocia, something like this. So it's way out to the east. Now, St. George was different to other people of his time. What was St. George's job, let's say? Well, he wasn't a teacher, certainly not an English teacher, but St. George was a soldier. What kind of soldier, you might ask? Well, St. George was what we call a member of the Praetorian Guard. What is, or really what was, the Praetorian Guard? The Praetorian Guard was the personal guard that defended the Roman emperors, okay? And they were established for the Roman emperors. They didn't exist in Republican times, but in imperial times, the Praetorian Guard, Praetorianus in Latin, Praetorian Guard, and they had an incredible influence on the Roman Empire, not just military, but the politics as well. Often the members of the Praetorian Guard would be involved in political scandals, removals, coup d'etat, and they would remove the emperor they didn't like and put in the emperor they wanted, for example. Although St. George was not this extreme. Now, St. George, as I said, was a member of this Praetorian Guard, but he was markedly different. Why was he different? How was he different? Because he was from Cappadocia? Because he was not from Italia, let's say? Well, no. The Roman Empire was very multicultural, and everybody was generally united by one culture, the cultura romana, the Roman culture, and the lingua latina, the Latin language. St. George was different for another reason. St. George was a Christian, okay? Now, you have to remember that the period of which I'm talking was, say, 300 AD, Anno Domini, after Christ. 300 AD was pre-Constantine Rome. So it's before Constantine declared, this is the state religion, we are now all Christian. This was when Rome was still worshipping the old gods, the pagan gods, Jupiter and Juno, Neptune, and all these different gods. So the Romans were still predominantly polytheistic. Polytheistic meaning worshipping and venerating many gods in the pantheon. Of course, Christianity was this new Abrahamic faith, and it was monotheistic. For any of you that speak a bit of Greek, monotheistic, one God. The Christians believed, and still believe today, one God for everything you see, everything that we know. He is responsible for it. Christianity was tolerated, let's say. It was tolerated in the Roman Empire, but it wasn't necessarily accepted per se, okay? St. George was a Christian in the Praetorian Guard, and he was accepted because he was, so they say, good at his job, right? Now, the problem is with St. George is, like we say with lots of legends, we're not necessarily sure what is fact, what is maybe fantasy, but the legend of St. George is thus. So there was a town called Nicene, okay? Now in English we would say Nicene, in Italian you might say Nicene, or in Latin Mycene, okay? And this was somewhere in Asia Minor, let's say somewhere out to the east, okay? And they sort of begged and asked St. George for help. Of course, at this point, he was not St. George, he was just George from around the block, right? And so they said, please help us. He said, well, what's wrong? And the townsfolk, the people of the town said, we are being plagued by a dragon. We don't know what to do. And the legend is thus. They had a dragon which lived by the lake in a cave. And every so often, the dragon would come out and it would attack the village. So the villagers decided to react. Okay, to appease the dragon, let's offer our sheep. Let's offer our livestock. And the dragon, thank you very much. Okay, see you next time. So the dragon came back next time. Okay, we don't have any sheep. So they offered, can you believe, their children. They offered their children. How did they do this? They did this by lottery. Random, completely random. Okay, you, off you go. But Mum, no, off you go. You're now a snack for Mr. Dragon, right? And so eventually they decided, we don't know what to do. They enlisted St. George for help. Now George came along and he was, remember, a Roman soldier, and he took his spear. Now some historical sources say it was a spear. In Latin it would have been called the pilum, okay, the long spear, or maybe a lance, something long. Anyway, the story was he confronted this dragon. This dragon came out and said, who dares defy me? George stuck his spear up the dragon, killed the dragon, and he slew the dragon. Slew, what does that mean? Well, slew comes from the verb in English to slay, S-L-A-Y, and it's irregular. It's kind of like the verb to fly. Slay, slew, S-L-E-W, and the past participle is slain, S-L-A-I-N. So St. George, or George, slew the dragon. In other words, he killed the dragon. The townspeople were incredibly grateful. Thank you, you're incredible. You are like an angel, you are like a saint. And all of the townspeople immediately converted to Christianity and became devout and worshipping Christians. That's one of the great legends of St. George. But like all good things in life, they have to come to an end eventually, a bit like the All Blacks in rugby, thankfully. And so St. George ultimately died, right? Why did he die? Because he refused to recant. What does that mean? The Roman emperor himself became suspicious of George because he was a Christian. I want you to convert to paganism. St. George refused and refused and refused, and of course, eventually, they killed him. They decapitated him, some sources say. But of course, he died. Now, of course, in the early Christian church, they really wanted to venerate people who were martyrs. Martyrs. Now, what is a martyr? It comes from the Greek word martyros, somebody who dies for their religion. And so George became Saint George. He was a martyr for the Christian religion. People who had such devout faith, they would not give in and they would not abandon their religion. Okay, the story proceeds. Much like all the other saints, over time, the legend of St. George grew. And St. George became particularly popular with soldiers. He became recognized as a type of military saint. Lots of soldiers worshipped St. George and prayed to St. George. Okay? So, how does this link in with England and Englishness? Well, we're coming to it. Norman conquest, 1066. The Normans conquered England, and with them they brought all of the continental saints. So lots of the, let's say, indigenous English saints were kicked aside, and the pro-Catholic saints were introduced, including St. George, okay? So St. George became the patron saint of England sometime in maybe the 1200s, we think. So how do we get to the flag? Well, the flag, this is the flag of England, by the way, right? But you might recognize this. This is also the flag of Genoa, okay? And in fact, sometime in the 1300s, Genoa and the Genoese fleet was incredibly powerful. There was this maritime republic, okay? And so lots of the English ships and boats copied the Genoese flag for protection. They didn't necessarily ask for permission, but in those times, who's to say? Now everything today is copyright this and copyright that, but all those years ago, it wasn't really an issue. Okay, so the Genoese flag was adopted by the English, and it became the English flag. However, it's not the only time we see this flag. This is, of course, a Christian cross, a red cross on a white background, kind of similar to my outfit today, right? So it's very commonly seen in other countries as well. St. George is celebrated in a multitude of other places. Countries, of course, including England, but also, for example, in Georgia, and it makes sense, the country of Georgia, St. George, Ethiopia, Greece, it's venerated in Greece, he's venerated, Russia, for example, and even some city-states, excuse me, even, for example, some city-states or regions. For example, in Spain, Catalonia venerates St. George. In Catalonia, from what I have understood, one of the common traditions on St. George's Day is to exchange books as gifts. In England, we don't really do that. What do we do? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. So, St. George's Day was celebrated on and off for hundreds of years, okay? And it's only really come into popularity maybe in the last 10, 15 or 20 years. Why? Well, within the UK, the United Kingdom, remember we have 4 countries: Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and of course, England. Now, with the government and devolution and the devolvement of power, more power to Scotland or to Wales or to Northern Ireland, the patriotism of the Celtic people, the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, began to increase, but not so much the English. And so us English thought, well, they're being patriotic about being Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish. We're still being patriotic for being British. Why don't we be patriotic for being English? And so you might ask, what's the difference between English and British? Well, English is just for England. British is for the UK, the 1, 2, 3, 4 countries I just mentioned. So what happens on St. George's Day in England? Well, funnily enough, St. George's Day in England is not a public holiday, but there are lots of claims. People are clamouring to make it a public holiday, much like St. Patrick's Day is a holiday in the Republic of Ireland and a bank holiday in Northern Ireland. Even if they are politically separate, they get to celebrate and have a drink together. Why not us English? We work hard enough, right? So St. George's Day, if it's every year it changes, of course. If it's on the Friday or on the weekend, we like to celebrate. How do we celebrate? Well, we try to wear red and white. These are the colours of England, okay? What else do we do? Some people like to have the national flower of England. The national flower of England, namely the red rose, coming from the House of Lancaster and, of course, the War of the Roses. So the red rose of England, and you see this, for example, in England rugby, they have a big red rose here, right? What else do we do on St. George's Day? Well, we might start the morning with a big English breakfast with your sausages and your bacon and your eggs and mushrooms and tomatoes, although Paul and Simon don't like mushrooms, they don't like it up. You might have beans as well, toast, really solid, hearty breakfast, as we say, right? A nice big English breakfast, a nice big mug of tea. Wash it down. Then you're ready for the day. Then you go out, okay? In the past, I have organised St. George's Day events as well. It involves, I won't lie, it involves a lot of this, okay? Lots of drink, lots of beer. Okay, but it's not just this. We are not simple-minded barbarians. We have culture to celebrate. St. George's Day is particularly important because of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare was born on the 23rd of April in the 1500s, and he died some 40, 50 years later on St. George's Day. So he was born on the 23rd of April, St. George's Day, and he died all those years later on St. George's Day. Is that a coincidence? I'll let you decide. Well, anyway, Shakespeare was a patriot, a very patriotic and proud Englishman, and he very much loved his country. And so a couple of years ago, in one of my local pubs in England, we had a recital, and my very own brother read a short extract from a very famous Shakespeare play. Okay, now I'll get to that in a moment. But St. George's Day, is it just for English people? Well, no, it's not. We don't celebrate necessarily English nationality, but we celebrate our English ways, what we like to do. Lots of things we have given the world. You know, we've given the world our language. We have given democracy through the Magna Carta, of course. We've given so many different things. We didn't always do great things in the past, but we've always done good things as well. And it's important to acknowledge that we English have had an incredible influence. Countries like the USA and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, where would they be without those English explorers? And so it brings me really to the last part for today. St. George's Day is for everyone. You don't have to be English to celebrate. Join in, have a drink with us. So if you're by yourself on this St. George's Day under lockdown, raise a glass to St. George, raise a glass to Englishness, or just raise a glass to me. Why not? Enjoy yourselves, have a good time. It's for everyone. Now, I mentioned Shakespeare. I'm going to read a very famous line from Shakespeare. And for this, I need my reading glasses because I'm not the one spring chicken I used to be. Now, King Henry, the play King Henry, Act 3, Scene 1. And the famous line is this: "The game is afoot. Follow your spirit. And upon this charge cry, God for Harry, England and St. George." And that's the famous line. And now, to finish, Jerusalem, England's national anthem. Happy St. George's Day. In ancient time, walk upon England's mountains, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures deep, and did the countenance divine shine forth upon those clouded hills, and was Jerusalem building upon those rocks